Talk. Religious tornado, Peelite difficulties. 1851 to 1852. I am always disposed to view with regret the rupture of party ties. My disposition is rather to maintain them. I confess I look, if not with suspicion, at least with disapprobation on anyone who is disposed to treat party connections as matters of small importance. My opinion is that party ties closely appertain to those principles of confidence which we entertain for the House of Commons. Gladstone, 1852. As we have seen, on the morning of his arrival from his Italian journey, February 26, 1851, Mr. Gladstone found that he was urgently required to meet Lord Stanley. Mortified by more than one repulse at the opening of the session, the Whigs had resigned. The Queen sent for the Protectionist leader. Stanley said that he was not then prepared to form a government, but that if other combinations failed, he would make the attempt. Lord John Russell was once more summoned to the palace, this time along with Aberdeen and Graham, the first move in a critical march towards the fated coalition between Whigs and Peelites. The negotiation broke off on the No Popery Bill. Lord John was committed to it, the other two strongly disapproved. The Queen next wished Aberdeen to undertake the task. Apparently not without some lingering doubts, he declined on the good ground that the House of Commons would not stand his attitude on papal aggression. 256, then according to promise Lord Stanley tried his hand. Proceedings were suspended for some days until Mr. Gladstone should be on the ground. He no sooner reached Carlton Gardens than Lord Lincoln arrived, eager to dissuade him from accepting office. Before the discussion had gone far, the Tory whip hurried in from Stanley, begging for an immediate visit. "I promised," says Mr. Gladstone, "to go directly after seeing Lord Aberdeen. But he came back with a fresh message to go at once, and hear what Stanley had to say. I did not like to stickle, and went. He told me his object was that I should take office with him, any office, subject to the reservation that the Foreign Department was offered to Canning, but if he declined it was open to me, along with others of which he named the Colonial Office and the Board of Trade. Nothing was said of the leadership of the House of Commons, but his anxiety was evident to have any occupant but one for the Foreign Office. I told him I should ask no questions and make no remark on these points, as none of them would constitute a difficulty with me, provided no preliminary obstacle were found to intervene. Stanley then said that he proposed to maintain the system of free trade generally, but to put a duty of 5 or 6 shillings on corn. I heard him pretty much in silence, but with an intense sense of relief, feeling that if he had put protection in abeyance, I might have had a most difficult question to decide, whereas now I had no question at all. I thought, however, it might be well that I should still see Lord Aberdeen before giving him an answer, and told him I would do so. I asked him also what was his intention with respect to papal aggression. He said that this measure was hasty and intemperate as well as ineffective, and that he thought something much better might result from a comprehensive and deliberate inquiry. I told him I was utterly against all penal legislation and against the ministerial bill, but that I did not on principle object to inquiry, that, on general as well as on personal grounds, I wished well to his undertakings, and that I would see Lord Aberdeen, but that what he had told me about corn constituted, I must not conceal from him, an enormous difficulty. I used this expression for the purpose of preparing him to receive the answer it was plain I must give. He told me his persevering would probably depend on me. Declines office. Mr. Gladstone next hastened to Lord Aberdeen, and learned what had been going on during his absence abroad. He learned also the clear opinions held by Aberdeen and Graham against no popery legislation, and noticed it as remarkable that so many minds should arrive independently at the same conclusion on a new question, and in opposition to the overwhelming majority. I then, he continues, went on to the levee, saw Lord Normanby and others, and began to bruit abroad the fame of the Neapolitan government. Immediately after leaving the levee, where I also saw Canning, told him what I meant to do, and gathered that he would do the like, I changed my clothes and went to give Lord Stanley my answer, at which he did not show the least surprise. He said he would still persevere, though with little hope. I think I told him it seemed to me he ought to do so. I was not 5 minutes with him this second time. 257. The protectionists having failed, and the Peelites standing aside, the Whigs came back, most of them well aware that they could not go on for long. The events of the late crisis had given Mr. Gladstone the hope that Graham would effectively place himself at the head of the Peelites, and that they would now at length begin to take an independent course of their own. But it soon appeared that, unconsciously, I think more than consciously, he is set upon the object of avoiding the responsibility either of taking the government with the Peel squadron, or of letting in Stanley and his friends. Here was the weak point in a strong and capable character. When Graham died 10 years after this, 1861, Mr. Gladstone wrote to a friend, "On administrative questions, for the last 20 years and more, I had more spontaneous recourse to him for advice, than to all other colleagues together." In some of the foundations of character no two men could be more unlike. One of his closest allies talks to Graham of "your somber temperament." "My forebodings are always gloomy," says Graham himself, "I shudder on the brink of the torrent." All accounts agree that he was a good counsellor in cabinet, a first-rate manager of business, a good if rather pompous speaker, admirably loyal and single-minded, but half-ruined by intense timidity. I have heard nobody use warmer language of commendation about him than Mr. Bright. But nature had not made him for a post of chief command. It by and by appeared that the Duke of Newcastle, known to us hitherto as Lord Lincoln, coveted the post of leader, but Mr. Gladstone thought that on every ground Lord Aberdeen was the person entitled to hold it. "I made," says Mr. Gladstone, "my views distinctly known to the Duke. He took no offence. I do not know what communications he may have held with others. But the upshot was that Lord Aberdeen became our leader. And this result was obtained without any shock or conflict." 258. 2. Bill against ecclesiastical titles. In the autumn of 1850 the people of this country were frightened out of their senses by a document from the Vatican, dividing England into dioceses bearing territorial titles and appointing Cardinal Wiseman to be Archbishop of Westminster. The uproar was tremendous. Lord John Russell cast fuel upon the flame in a perverse letter to the Bishop of Durham, November 4, 1850. In this unhappy document he accepted the description of the aggression of the Pope upon our Protestantism as insolent and insidious, declared his indignation to be greater even than his alarm, and even his alarm at the aggressions of a foreign sovereign to be less than at the conduct of unworthy sons of the Church of England within her own gates. He wound up by declaring that the great mass of the nation looked with contempt upon the mummeries of superstition. Justified indeed was Bright's stern rebuke to a Prime Minister of the Queen who thus allowed himself to offend and to indict 8 millions of his countrymen, recklessly to create fresh discords between the Irish and English nations, and to perpetuate animosities that the last 25 years had done so much to assuage. Having thus precipitately committed himself, the minister was forced to legislate. "I suspect," wrote Mr. Gladstone to his great friend, Sir Walter James, "John Russell has more rocks and breakers ahead than he reckoned upon when he dipped his pen in gall to smite first the Pope, but most those who not being Papists are such traitors and fools as really to mean something when they say, 'I believe in one holy Catholic Church.'" There was some division of opinion in the Cabinet, 259, but a bill was settled, and the temper of the times may be gauged by the fact that leave to introduce it was given by the overwhelming majority of 395 votes to 63. In his own language, Mr. Gladstone lamented and disapproved of the Pope's proceeding extremely, and had taken care to say so in Parliament 2.5 years before, when Lord John Russell, if he had chosen, could have stopped it, but the government and the press were alike silent at that period. 260. His attitude is succinctly described in a letter to Greswell, his Oxford chairman, in 1852. "Do not let it be asserted without contradiction that I ever felt or counselled indifference in regard to the division of England into Romish dioceses. So far is this from being the truth that shortly after I was elected, when the government were encouraging the Pope to proceed, and when there was yet time to stop the measure, which I deplore sincerely, by amicable means, I took the opportunity in the House, as did Sir Inglis, I think a little later, of trying to draw attention to it. But it was nobody's game then, and the subject fell to the ground. Amicable prevention I desired, spiritual and ecclesiastical resistance I heartily approved, but while I say this, I cannot recede from 1 inch of the ground I took in opposing the bill, and I would far rather quit Parliament forever than not have voted against so pernicious a measure. Other matters, as we have seen, brought on a ministerial crisis. The bill was stopped, and after the crisis was over the measure came to life again with changes making it still more futile for its ends. The Peelites, while, like Mr. Bright, despising and loathing the language of the Vatican and the Flaminian Gate, had all of them without concert taken this outburst of prejudice and passion at its right value, and all resolved to resist legislation. How, they asked, could you tolerate the Roman Catholic religion if you would not tolerate its tenet of the ecclesiastical supremacy of the Pope, and what sort of toleration of such a tenet would that be, which forbade the Pope to name ecclesiastics to exercise the spiritual authority exercised in any other voluntary episcopal church, Scottish, colonial, or another? Why was it more of a usurpation for the Pope to make a new Archbishop of Westminster, than to administer London by the old form of vicars apostolic? Was not the action of the Pope, after all, a secondary consideration, and the frenzy really and in essence an explosion of popular wrath against the Puseites? What was to be thought of a Prime Minister who, at such risk to the public peace, tried to turn the ferment to account for the sake of strengthening his tottering government? To all this there was no rational reply, and even the editor of a powerful newspaper that every morning blew up the coals, admitted to Greville that he thought the whole thing humbug and a pack of nonsense. 261. Great speech against the bill. The debate on the second reading was marked by a little brutality and much sanctimony. Mr. Gladstone, March 25, 1851, spoke to a House practically almost solid against him. Yet his superb resources as an orator, his transparent depth of conviction, the unmistakable proofs that his whole heart was in the matter, mastered his audience and made the best of them and their hearts ashamed. He talked of Boniface VIII and Honorius IX. He pursued a long and close historical demonstration of the earnest desire of the lay Catholics of this country for diocesan bishops as against vicars apostolic. He moved among bulls and rescripts, briefs and pastorals and canon law, with as much ease as if he had been arguing about taxes and tariffs. Through it all the House watched and listened in enchantment, as to a magnificent tragedian playing a noble part in a foreign tongue. They did not apprehend every point, nor were they converted, but they felt a man with the orator's quality of taking fire and kindling fire at a moral idea. They felt his command of the whole stock of fact and of principle belonging to his topics, as with the air and the power of a heroic master he cleared the way before him towards his purpose. Along with complete grasp of details, went grasp of some of the most important truths in the policy of a modern state. He clearly perceived the very relevant fact, so often overlooked by advocates of the free church in a free state, that there is no religious body in the world where religious offices do not in a certain degree conjoin with temporal incidents. But this did not affect the power of his stroke, as he insisted on respect for the frontier, no scientific frontier, between temporal and spiritual. You speak of the progress of the Roman Catholic religion, and you pretend to meet that progress by a measure false in principle as it is ludicrous in extent. You must meet the progress of that spiritual system by the progress of another, you can never do it by penal enactments. Here, once for all, I enter my most solemn, earnest, and deliberate protest against all attempts to meet the spiritual dangers of our Church by temporal legislation of a penal character. The whole speech is in all its elements and aspects one of the great orator's 3 or 4 most conspicuous masterpieces, and the reader would not forgive me if I failed to transcribe its resplendent close. He went back to a passage of Lord John Russell's on the Maynooth Bill of 1845. I never heard, said Mr. Gladstone, a more impressive passage delivered by any statesman at any time in this House. The noble lord referred to some beautiful and touching lines of Virgil, which the House will not regret to hear. Silis editi tempus veniet, cum fini bacillus. Agricola, incurvo terram mollitus eratro. Excisa inveniat scabra robagine pila. Aut gravibus rastris galeus pulsabit inanes. Grandiaca fossis mirabiter ossa sepulchris. 262. And he said, upon those scenes where battles have been fought, the hand of nature effaces the traces of the wrath of man, and the cultivator of the soil in following times finds the rusted arms, and looks upon them with calm and joy, as the memorials of forgotten strife, and is quickening his sense of the blessings of his peaceful occupation. The noble lord went on to say, in reference to the powerful opposition then offered to the bill for the endowment of Maynooth, that it seems as if upon the questions of religious freedom, our strife is never to cease, and our arms are never to rust. Would any man, who heard the noble lord deliver these impressive sentiments, have believed not only that the strife with respect to religious liberty was to be revived with a greater degree of acerbity in the year 1851, but that the noble lord himself was to be a main agent in its revival, that his was to be the head that was to wear the helmet, and his the hand that was to grasp the spear? My conviction is, that this great subject of religious freedom is not to be dealt with, as one of the ordinary matters in which you may, with safety or with honor, do today and undo tomorrow. This great people, whom we have the honor to represent, moves slowly in politics and legislation, but, although it moves slowly, it moves steadily. The principle of religious freedom, its adaptation to our modern state, and its compatibility with ancient institutions, was a principle which you did not adopt in haste. It was a principle well tried in struggle and conflict. It was a principle which gained the assent of one public man after another. It was a principle which ultimately triumphed, after you had spent upon it half a century of agonizing struggle. And now what are you going to do? You have arrived at the division of the century. Are you going to repeat Penelope's process, but without the purpose of Penelope? Are you going to spend the decay and the dusk of the 19th century in undoing the great work which with so much pain and difficulty your greatest men have been achieving during its daybreak and its youth? Surely not. Oh, recollect the functions you have to perform in the face of the world. Recollect that Europe and the whole of the civilized world look to England at this moment not less, no, but even more than ever they looked to her before, as the mistress and guide of nations, in regard to the great work of civil legislation. And what is it they chiefly admire in England? It is not the rapidity with which you form constitutions and broach abstract theories. On the contrary, they know that nothing is so distasteful to you as abstract theories, and that you are proverbial for resisting what is new until you are well assured by gradual effort, by progressive trials, and beneficial tendency. But they know that when you make a step forward you keep it. They know that there is reality and honesty, strength and substance, about your proceedings. They know that you are not a monarchy today, a republic tomorrow, and a military despotism the day after. They know that you have been happily preserved from irrational vicissitudes that have marked the career of the greatest and noblest among the neighboring nations. Your fathers and yourselves have earned this brilliant character for England. Do not forfeit it. Do not allow it to be tarnished or impaired. Show, I beseech you, have the courage to show the Pope of Rome, and his cardinals, and his church, that England too, as well as Rome, has her semper idem, and that when she has once adopted some great principle of legislation, which is destined to influence the national character, to draw the dividing lines of her policy for ages to come, and to affect the whole nature of her influence and her standing among the nations of the world, show that when she has done this slowly, and done it deliberately, she has done it once for all, and that she will then no more retrace her steps than the river that bathes this giant city can flow back upon its source. The character of England is in our hands. Let us feel the responsibility that belongs to us, and let us rely on it. If today we make this step backwards, it is one which hereafter we shall have to retrace with pain. We cannot change the profound and resistless tendencies of the age towards religious liberty. It is our business to guide and to control their application. Do this you may, but to endeavor to turn them backwards is the sport of children, done by the hands of men, and every effort you may make in that direction will recoil upon you in disaster and disgrace. The noble lord appealed to gentlemen who sit behind me, in the names of Hampden and Pym. I have great reverence for these in one portion at least of their political career, because they were men energetically engaged in resisting oppression. But I would rather have heard Hampden and Pym quoted on any other subject than one which relates to the mode of legislation or the policy to be adopted with our Roman Catholic fellow citizens, because, if there was one blot on their escutcheon, if there was one painful, I would almost say odious feature in the character of the party among whom they were the most distinguished chiefs, it was the bitter and ferocious intolerance which in them became the more powerful because it was directed against the Roman Catholics alone. I would appeal in other names to gentlemen who sit on this side of the House. If Hampden and Pym were friends of freedom, so were Clarendon and Newcastle, so were the gentlemen who sustained the principles of loyalty. They were not always seeking to tighten the chains and deepen the brand. Their disposition was to relax the severity of the law, and attract the affections of their Roman Catholic fellow subjects to the Constitution by treating them as brethren. We are a minority insignificant in point of numbers. We are more insignificant still, because we are but knots in groups of 2 or 3, we have no power of cohesion, no ordinary bond of union. What is it that binds us together against you, but the conviction that we have on our side the principle of justice, the conviction that we shall soon have on our side the strength of public opinion? Oh, I am sure I have not wished to say a syllable that would wound the feelings of any man, and if in the warmth of argument such expressions should have escaped me, I wish them unsaid. But above all we are sustained by the sense of justice which we feel belongs to the cause we are defending, and we are, I trust, well determined to follow that bright star of justice, beaming from the heavens, whithersoever it may lead. All this was of no avail, just as the same arguments and temper on 2 other occasions of the same eternal theme in his life, 263, were to be of no avail. Disraeli spoke strongly against the line taken by the Peelites. The second reading was carried by 438 against 95, 1/3 even of this minority being Irish Catholics, and the rest mainly Peelites, a limited but accomplished school, as Disraeli styled them. Hume asked Mr. Gladstone for his speech for publication to circulate among the dissenters who, he said, know nothing about religious liberty. It was something, however, to find Mr. Gladstone, the greatest living churchman, and Bright, the greatest living nonconformist, voting in the same lobby. The fight was stiff, and was kept up until the end of the summer. The weapon that had been forged in this blazing furnace by these clumsy armorers proved blunt and worthless. The law was from the first a dead letter, and it was struck out of the statute book in 1871 in Mr. Gladstone's own administration, 264. 3. Fall of the Russell government. In the autumn 1851, a committee of the Whig cabinet, now reinforced by the admission for the first time of Lord Granville, was named to prepare a reform bill. Palmerston, no friend to reform, fell into restive courses that finally upset the coach. The cabinet, early in November, settled that he should not receive Kossuth, and he complied, but he received a public deputation and an address complimenting him for his exertions on Kossuth's behalf. The court at this proceeding took lively offence, and the Queen requested the Prime Minister to ascertain the opinion of the Cabinet upon it. Such an appeal by the Sovereign from the Minister to the Cabinet was felt by them to be unconstitutional, and though they did not conceal from Palmerston their general dissatisfaction, they declined to adopt any resolution. Before the year ended, Palmerston persisted in taking an unauthorized line of his own upon Napoleon's coup d'état, this time for once not on the side of freedom against despotism, and Lord John closed a correspondence between them by telling him that he could not advise the Queen to leave the seals of the Foreign Department any longer in his hands. This dismissal of Palmerston introduced a new element of disruption and confusion, for the fallen minister had plenty of friends. Lord Lansdowne was very uneasy about reform, and talked ominously about preferring to be a supporter rather than a member of the government, and Whig dissensions, though less acute in type, threatened a perplexity as sharp in the way of a stable administration as the discords among Conservatives. Lord John, January 14, 1852, next asked his cabinet whether an offer should be made to Graham. A long discussion followed, whether Graham alone would do them any good, whether the Peelites, considering themselves as a party, might join, but would not consent to be absorbed, whether an offer to them was to be a persistent attempt in good faith or only a device to mend the parliamentary case, if the offer were made and refused. 2 or 3 of the Whig ministers, true to the church traditions of the caste, made great difficulties about the Puseyite notions of Newcastle and Mr. Gladstone. Gladstone, writes one of them, is a Jesuit, and more Peelite than I believe was Peel himself. In the end Lord John Russell and his men met Parliament without any new support. Their tottering life was short, and it was an amendment moved by Palmerston, February 20th, on a clause in a militia bill, that slit the thread. The hostile majority was only 11, but other perils lay pretty thick in front. The ministers resigned, and Lord Stanley, who had now become Earl of Derby, had no choice but to give his followers their chance. The experiment that seemed so impossible when Bentinck first tried it, of forming a new third party in the state, seemed up to this point to have prospered, and the protectionists had a definite existence. The ministers were nearly all new to public office, and 17 of them were for the first time sworn of the Privy Council in a single day. One jest was that the cabinet consisted of 3 men and a half, Derby, Disraeli, St. Leonard's, and a worthy fractional personage at the Admiralty. Sending to his wife at Harden a provisional list, February 23, Mr. Gladstone doubts the way in which the offices were distributed. It is not good, as compared with what it should have been. Disraeli could not have been worse placed than at the Exchequer. Henley could not have been worse than at the Board of Trade. T. of Baring, who would have been their best Chancellor of the Exchequer, seems to have declined. Harries would have been much better than Disraeli for that particular place. I suppose Lord Malmesbury is temporary Foreign Secretary, to hold the place for S. Canning. What does not appear on the face of the case is, who is to lead the House of Commons, and about that everybody seems to be in the dark. 4. First Derby Administration. The first Derby administration, thus formed and covering the year 1852, marks a highly interesting stage in Mr. Gladstone's career. The key to my position, as he afterwards said, was that my opinions went one way, my lingering sympathies the other. His opinions looked towards liberalism, his sympathies drew him to his first party. It was the Peelites who had now been thrown into the case of a dubious third party. At the end of February Mr. Gladstone sought Lord Aberdeen, looking to his weight, his prudence, and his kindliness of disposition as the main anchor of their section. His tone has usually been, during the last few years, that of anxiety to reunite the fragments and reconstruct the Conservative Party, but yesterday, particularly at the commencement of our conversation, he seemed to lean the other way, spoke kindly of Lord Derby and wished that he could be extricated from the company with which he is associated, said that though called a despot all his life, he himself had always been, and was now, friendly to a liberal policy. He did not, however, like the reform question in Lord John's hands, but he considered, I thought, and if so he differed from me, that on church questions we all might cooperate with him securely. Mr. Gladstone, on the contrary, insisted that their duty plainly was to hold themselves clear and free from Whig and Derbyite alike, so as to be prepared to take whatever of 3 courses might, after the defeat of protectionist proposals, seem most honourable, whether Conservative reconstruction, or Liberal conjunction, or Peelism single-handed. The last he described as their least natural position, for, he urged, they might be Liberal in the sense of Peel, working out a Liberal policy through the medium of the Conservative Party. To that procrastinating view Mr. Gladstone stood tenaciously, and his course now is one of the multitudinous illustrations of his constant abhorrence of premature committal, and the taking of a second step before the first. After Aberdeen he approached Graham, who proceeded to use language that seemed to point to his virtual return to his old friends of the Liberal Party, for the reader will not forget the striking circumstance that the new head of a Conservative government, and the most trusted of the cabinet colleagues of Peel, had both of them begun official life in the Reform Ministry of Lord Grey. Graham said he had a very high opinion of Lord Derby's talents and character, and that Lord J. Russell had committed many errors, but that looking at the two as they stood, he thought that the opinions of Lord Derby as a whole were more dangerous to the country than those of Lord John. Mr. Gladstone said it did not appear to him that the question lay between these two, but Graham's reception of this remark implied a contrary opinion. Lincoln, now Duke of Newcastle, he found obdurate in another direction, speaking with great asperity against Lord Derby and his party. He would make no vows as to junction, not even that he would not join Disraeli, but he thought this government must be opposed and overthrown. Then those who led the charge against it would reap the reward. If the Peelites did not place themselves in a prominent position, others would. They had a further conversation. The Duke told him that Beresford, the whip, had sent out orders to Tory newspapers to run them down, that the same worthy had said to the Peelites, "Let them go to hell." Mr. Gladstone replied that Beresford's language was not a good test of the feelings of his party, and that his violence and that of other people was stimulated by what they imagined or heard of the Peelites. Newcastle persisted in his disbelief in the government. During this conversation, held on a sofa at the Carlton, we were rather warm, and I said to him, "It appears to me that you do not believe this party to be composed even of men of honor or of gentlemen." He clung to the idea that we were hereafter to form a party of our own, containing all the good elements of both parties. To which I replied, "The country cannot be governed by a third or middle party unless it be for a time only, and on the whole I thought a liberal policy would be worked out with greater security to the country through the medium of the Conservative party, and I thought a position like Peel's on the liberal side of that party preferable, comparing all advantages and disadvantages, to the Conservative side of the Liberal party." And when he spoke of the Tories as the obstructive body, I said not all of them, for instance Mr. Pitt, Mr. Canning, Mr. Huskisson, and in some degree Lord Londonderry and Lord Liverpool. 4 shades of Peelites. The upshot of all these discussions was the discovery that there were at least 4 distinct shades among the Peelites. Newcastle stands nearly alone, if not quite, in the rather high-flown idea that we are to create and lead a great, virtuous, powerful, intelligent party, neither the actual Conservative nor the actual Liberal party but a new one. Apart from these witcheries, Graham was ready to take his place in the Liberal ranks. Cardwell, Fitzroy and Oswald would I think have gone with him, as F. Peel and Sir C. Douglas went before him. But this section has been arrested, not thoroughly amalgamated, owing to Graham. Thirdly, there are the great bulk of the Peelites from Goulburn downwards, more or less undisguisedly anticipating junction with Lord Derby, and avowing that free trade is their only point of difference. Lastly myself, and I think I am with Lord Aberdeen and S. Herbert, who have nearly the same desire, but feel that the matter is too crude, too difficult and important for anticipating any conclusion, and that our clear line of duty is independence, until the question of protection shall be settled. March 28, 1852. The personal composition of this section deserves a sentence. In 1835, during Peel's short government, the Whig phalanx opposed to it in the House of Commons consisted of John Russell and 7 others. 265 of these 8 all were alive in 1851, 7 of them in the then existing cabinet, 6 of the 8 still in the Commons. On the other hand, Peel's cabinet began its career thus manned in the Commons: Peel, Stanley, Graham, Hardinge, Knatchbull, Goulburn. Of these only the last remained in his old position. Peel and Knatchbull were dead, Stanley in the Lords and separated, Graham isolated, Hardinge in the Lords and by way of having retired. Nor was the band very large even as recruited. Of ex-cabinet ministers there were but 3 commoners, Goulburn, Herbert, Gladstone. And of others who had held important offices there were only available, Clerk, Cardwell, Sir J. Young, H. Corey. The Lords contributed Aberdeen, Newcastle, Canning, 266, Street Germains and the Duke of Argyll. Such, as counted off by Mr. Gladstone, was the Peelite staff. Graham in April made his own position definitely Liberal, or Whig and something more, in so pronounced a way as to cut him off from the Gladstonian subdivision or main body of the Peelites. Mr. Gladstone read the speech in which this departure was taken, with discomfort and surprise. He instantly went to read to Lord Aberdeen some of the more pungent passages. 1 or 2 consultations were held with Newcastle and Goulburn, and all agreed that Graham's words were decisive. I mentioned that some of them were coming to 5 Carlton Gardens in the course of the afternoon, April 20th, and my first wish was that now Lord Aberdeen himself would go and tell them how we stood upon Graham's speech. To this they were all opposed, and they seemed to feel that as we had had no meeting yet, it would seem ungracious and unkind to an old friend to hold one by way of ovation over his departure. It was therefore agreed that I should acquaint Young. It was their wish that he should tell anyone who might come, that we, who were there present, looked upon our political connection with Graham as dissolved by the Carlisle speech. 267. Attitude of Graham. The temporary parting from Graham was conducted with a degree of good feeling that is a pattern for such occasions in politics. In writing to Mr. Gladstone, March 29, 1852, and speaking of his colleagues in Peel's government, Graham says, "I have always felt that my age and position were different from theirs, that the habits and connections of my early political life, though broken, gave to me a bias, which to them was not congenial, and since the death of our great master and friend, I have always feared that the time might arrive when we must separate. You intimate the decision that party connection must no longer subsist between us. I submit to your decision with regret, but at parting I hope that you will retain towards me some feelings of esteem and regard, such as I can never cease to entertain towards you, and though political friendships are often short-lived, having known each other well, we shall continue, I trust, to maintain kindly relations. It is a pleasure to me to remember that we have no cause of complaint against each other." "I have to thank you," Mr. Gladstone replies, "for the unvarying kindness of many years, to acknowledge all the advantages I have derived from communication with you, to accept and re-echo cordially your expressions of goodwill, and to convey the fervent hope that no act or word of mine may ever tend to impair these sentiments in my own mind or yours." When the others had withdrawn, Aberdeen told Mr. Gladstone that Lord John had been to call upon him the day before for the first time, and he believed that the visit had special reference to Mr. Gladstone himself. The tenor of his conversation, Mr. Gladstone reports, was that my opinions were quite as liberal as his, that in regard to the colonies I went beyond him, that my Naples pamphlets could have been called revolutionary if he had written them, and in regard to church matters he saw no reason why there should not be joint action, for he was cordially disposed to maintain the Church of England, and so, he believed, was I. Lord John, however, we may be sure was the last man not to know how many. Another element, besides agreement in opinion, decides relations of party. Personal sympathies and antipathies, hosts of indirect affinities having apparently little to do with the main trunk of the school or the faction, hosts of motives only half disclosed, or not disclosed at all even to him in whom they are at work, all these intrude in the composition and management of parties whether religious or political. Grave discussions turned on new nicknames. The Tories had greatly gained by calling themselves Conservatives after 1832. The name of Whig had some associations that were only less unpopular in the country than the name of Tory. It was pointed out that many people would on no account join the Whigs, who yet would join a government of which Russells, Greys, Howards, Cavendishes, Villierses were members. On the other hand, Graham declared that Paley's maxim about religion was just as true in politics, that men often change their creed, but not so often the name of their sect. And as to the suggestion, constantly made at all times in our politics for the benefit of waverers, of the name of Liberal Conservative, Lord John caustically observed that Whig has the convenience of expressing in one syllable what Liberal Conservative expresses in 7, and Whiggism in 2 syllables what Conservative Progress expresses in 6. Mr. Gladstone and his group. Connected with all this arose a geographical question: in what quarter of the House were the Peelites to sit? Hitherto the two wings of the broken Tory party, Protectionist and Peelite, had sat together on the opposition benches. The change of administration in 1852 sent the Protectionists over to the Speaker's right, and brought the Whigs to the natural place of opposition on his left. The Peelite leaders therefore had no other choice than to take their seats below the gangway, but on which side? Such a question is always graver than to the heedless outsider it may seem, and the Peelite discussions upon it were both copious and vehement. 268. Graham at once resolved on sharing the front opposition bench with the Whigs. He repeated that his own case was different from the others, because he had once been a Whig himself. Herbert, who acted pretty strictly with Mr. Gladstone all this year, argued that they only held aloof from the new ministers on one question, and therefore that they ought not to sit opposite to them as adversaries, but should sit below the gangway on the ministerial side. Newcastle intimated dissent from both, looking to the formation of his virtuous and enlightened third party, but where they should sit in the meantime he did not seem to know. Mr. Gladstone expressed from the first a decided opinion in favor of going below the gangway on the opposition side. What they ought to desire was the promotion of a government conservative in its personal composition and traditions, as soon as the crisis of protection should be over. Taking a seat, he said, is an external sign and pledge that ought to follow upon full conviction of the thing it was understood to betoken, and to sit on the front opposition bench would indicate division from the conservative government as a party, while in fact they were not divided from them as a party, but only on a single question. In the end, Graham sat above the opposition gangway next to Lord John Russell and Cardwell. The Peelite body as a whole determined on giving the new government what is called a fair trial. Mr. Sidney Herbert and I, says Mr. Gladstone, took pains to bring them together, in the recognized modes. They sat on the opposition side, but below the gangway, full, or about 40 strong, and Sir James Graham, I recollect, once complimented me on the excellent appearance they had presented to him as he passed them and walking up the house. Considerable uneasiness was felt among some of them at finding themselves neighbours on the benches to Cobden and Bright and Hume and their friends on the one hand, and the Irish brass band on the other. It depended entirely on the Peelites whether the new government should be permitted to conduct the business of the session, subject to conditions or otherwise, or whether they should be open to an instant attack as the enemies of free trade. The effect of such attack must have been defeat, followed by dissolution forthwith, and by the ejection of the Derby government in June, as happened in 1859, instead of in December. The tactics of giving the ministers a fair trial prevailed and were faithfully adhered to, Graham and Cardwell taking their own course. As the result of this and other conditions, for 10 months ministers, greatly outnumbered, were maintained in power by the deliberate and united action of about 40 Peelites. Lord Derby had opened his administration with a pledge, as the Peelites understood, to confine himself during the session to business already open and advanced, or of an urgent character. When Mr. Disraeli gave notice of a bill to dispose of 4 seats which were vacant, this was regarded by them as a manner of opening new and important issues, and not within the definition that had been the condition of their provisional support. 269, Lord John Russell came and said to me, says Mr. Gladstone, "What will you do?" I admitted we were bound to act, and, joining the Liberals, we threw over the proposal by a large majority. This was the only occasion of conflict that arose, and it was provoked, as we thought, by the government itself.